Joanne Bundy. If you will silence your cell phones and turn on your tea coil, I will do a couple of announcements for you. First of all, you'll notice there's a sign in front of the men's restroom that says that it's out of order. That is not an April Fool's joke. It really is. But you can use the family room that's in that same area, or go around the corner in your children's department where there is another family room. This morning, we are evaluating not only Jerry's course, but anything about the bucket courses. And that's that half sheet of paper that you have on your chairs or tables. It is not a requirement that you fill it out, but we appreciate it if you do, because you give us some wonderful ideas and suggestions for our bucket courses classes. So if you would like to fill that out, then you could just leave it on the table in the hallway, either at the break time or when you leave. Next Wednesday is Open Wednesday, and Sarah Purcell will be here to talk about the death of Abraham Lincoln. Now, if you know Sarah Purcell, you know that she's an expert on the Civil War and an outstanding lecturer. There is no fee and no registration, and so the only thing for you to do if you want to get in the class is to get here early. So I encourage you to do so. It will be an excellent lecture, I'm sure. And now this morning, we have the last of the 3-class lecture by Professor Jerry LaLonde, and it is Writing, History of a Technology. Go ahead, Jerry.
Thank you. Sound okay? I knew I would still get evaluated after getting tenure, but I thought once I retired. I thank Nancy Molly for the cartoon. We finished last time talking about the decipherment of linear beat by Michael Ventris, 1952. The tablets, about 4,000 of them, between those from Pylos and Knossos, give us a tremendous amount of information about how a Mycenaean kingdom was run. Geography, the bureaucracy, the various officials, the religion, its cult, cult officials. So it was a great compliment to the rest of my Mycenaean archaeology that came from the excavations of places like Mycenae and Pylos. There certainly are more than 30,000 lines of Greek text in the linear beat tablets, and there's not one line of poetry. For one thing, syllabic script does not lend itself well to poetry, but I think also the Mycenaeans reserved poetry, sung usually to a musical instrument, for the really important matters like the glorification of the king and his people. We know that the oral tradition in poetic form existed in the Bronze Age and in the Dark Ages that followed, because those Homeric poems, the Iliad, the Odyssey, refer to things that we know existed, objects, places, people that existed only in the Bronze Age and in the later period of decline, eventually written down in the great epics. The early idea of Greek afterlife, or the early Greek idea of afterlife, was a pretty grim thing. In the Odyssey, when Odysseus meets Achilles, who has come up from the underworld, Achilles says to him, "I would rather be a servant in the upper world than king of the underworld." So the kind of immortality that these great people sought was to be glorified in the poetic song for generations after their own time. Achilles also is a key figure here. When he's alienated from Agamemnon in the Iliad and the ambassadors come to him in Book 9, he's in a terrible position of irony because he knows he's fated to die young, but because he's on the out, he may not be able to achieve the glory that will give him the immortality that will balance out his fate. And when the ambassadors arrive, he is seen playing the lyre and singing of the Clea Andron, that is, the great deeds of men. Well, writing was lost then to the Greeks with the destruction of the Mycenaean kingdoms. But it is preserved in the Near East and Egypt. Whenever there's a decline of civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean, the Nile Valley, with its isolation and its great fertility from its annual floods, civilization is always preserved there. And it's from this area that we will trace again the progress of writing. Right here in this area we call the Sinai was the earliest form of Semitic writing, a script called Proto-Semitic, which you can see here. This becomes the ancestor of all later syllabic scripts throughout the Middle Near East and Europe. It also establishes the canonical order of these signs. You can see their value here, equivalent to our ABC, though the vowels, our vowel signs were not vowels in the Old Semitic system. This is a syllabic, a consonantal syllabary, and the aleph in Semitic was really a rough breathing sign, an aspirate sign. So we can look again at this stemma, the family tree. Proto-Semitic goes back to about 1800 BC, and from it come all of these modern systems of writing that dominate most of the world. We will trace now the line from North Semitic to Phoenician to the Greek script, which is the first alphabet, and then the contemporary alphabets of Europe. It all starts about the 9th century when the Phoenicians opened up trade again with the Greek islands and the mainland, and probably the Greeks in the other direction. Again, the great production of wine and olive oil, which is suited to the terrain of Greece, was in high demand in the Near East. And the Phoenicians brought to the Greeks, it probably came in that direction, this system of writing. But the Greeks instituted a very canny innovation to this consonantal syllabary. They took the leftover signs. You see here the Phoenician syllabary. I've crossed out the word alphabet. Some Semitic scholars like to say, well, if you don't call it an alphabet, then it depreciates the value of Phoenician in the history of writing. But the substitution of vowels was an extremely important innovation. And the alphabet comes into Greek in several places with slight variations. Some of them are variations in the form of the signs. Some are slight variations in the use of the signs. And then there are the absence and presence of a few signs. But these local scripts that came to Greece were writing's equivalent of dialects. They were mutually intelligible, but they were slightly different from one another. And one of these early alphabets is that of the Athenians, the Attic dialect, or the Attic script. It eventually unites with that from Asia Minor and the islands, the Ionian ethnic group of Greeks. And that becomes the classical Greek alphabet, which eventually evolves to a common single Greek alphabet, writing's equivalent of Koine or Common Greek. And that is the alphabet of the modern Greeks today. But we'll talk about our own alphabet as it descends from that. One of the great questions that surrounds Greek writing is how it got to this part of the world and when. There's a lot of the earliest Greek writing, which you see on the shoulder of this vase. It dates from the late 8th century. It's written from right to left, as was the style of Phoenician writing, and the Greeks adopted that direction for their writing for a while. It's interesting that these early forms of writing had great versatile use by the Greeks. They were used for funerary monuments, political documents of all kinds, boundary markers, poetry. So it's quite a switch from all of that bookkeeping of the Mycenaean peoples. This inscription says, of all of the dancers, this dekalmein is a kind of vase, is for the one who performs most gracefully. So this was a prize in some kind of musical contest. Most of the Greek literature that we have, the history, the philosophy, the poetry, comes down to us through many copies, transmission of text through the ages. But because of archaeology, we have some original writings of the Greeks in many forms, and most of them are on stone, some are on ceramics. This branch of writing is called epigraphy, anything written on a hard surface, as distinct, say, from papyrology, which is the study of text on papyrus. These are two boundary stones that were found in situ in the Athenian Agora, which is the ancient civic center of that city-state. We can see them better in a drawing. And they give us some interesting facts about early Greek writing. These date from the end of the 6th century. Notice that the two of them are written in different directions. And this is a period when the Greeks are writing either way. And the great German epigraphist Adolf Wilhelm gave us the theory that sometimes the direction of the writing was geared to the direction that one approaches it from. If I can end with a preposition. So someone walking along the street in the Agora in this direction, this boundary stone was placed so that you would read it from right to left, and vice versa. Another interesting thing is that the stone speaks to us. This is one of thousands of examples of very early Greek inscriptions where the people were not quite sure that writing was different from speech, even though we've made that distinction very well. It says, I am the boundary of the Agora. There are all kinds of votive offerings found in various religious contexts that say, Ptolemy gave me to Aphrodite, or I belong to Aphrodite, I belong to Zeus. So these speaking objects. So I'll talk more about the direction of writing. Can't see this very well. Ancient inscriptions had the letter grooves highlighted with pigment. We have enough evidence of some inscriptions that have traces of bright blue or red pigment that was in the letters. You don't need to know the text here, but if you look at it carefully, the first line goes from left to right, and then the next right to left, and vice versa. This is a style of writing called boustrophedon, which means as the ox turns. We would today call it tractor writing. Another feature of Greek inscriptions, especially at the height of the classical period, 5th century Athens, is that the letters were placed on a grid. The scribe or the mason, before this inscription was made, would have drafted lines in pencil complete checkerboard, and then a single letter appears within each square. This is a parallel to what we spoke about in Chinese writing, where calligraphy requires that these particular characters be within an exact row in any direction. This is an Athenian decree about, it's an anti-pollution decree, telling the what do you call them, tanners, that they are not allowed to throw their refuse into the Ilissus River above a certain point. The Athenians were quite prolific in what they wrote about, and now we can also say something about literacy. One scholar has divided the levels of literacy into three, calling the first the scribal level, and this would be characteristic of the autocrats and powerful people of Egypt and the Near East, where literacy was limited to those few people who qualified as scribes. Part of that limitation was the difficulty of those early systems of writing. But the second class, this scholar calls apprentice writing, where approximately 10 to 15% of the people would know how to read and write. And this is a characteristic of the use of Greek, especially by the Athenians. This method of writing in its simplicity was very conducive to the evolution of democracy, where people played a close role in the Athenian government. Every year, 500 citizens were elected to come to Athens and take part in a council that prepared all legislation for the assembly of all of the citizens. And there were 6,000 jurors who were in attendance at Athens every year. So there had to be some fair level, it's hard to pin it down exactly, but a fair level of literacy. And we get some conception of it from these ostraca. This is another interesting part of Athenian democracy. When Cleisthenes reformed the constitution at the end of the 6th century, there was a worry about tyrants, that is, the former powerful class taking over the government. And he instituted a system called ostracism, which of course comes into our language. And it was a way of getting rid of potential tyrants. And it worked in this way. Each year the Athenian citizens could decide whether they wanted the taking of the ostraca. And if they did, the agora was fenced off with 10 gates, one for each of the voting groups of citizens. And you went through the gate and you deposited a sherd into a bin where you had written the name of the person you most wanted to get rid of. It's a huge unpopularity contest. A lot of famous people were ostracized. Themistocles, the great hero of the Persian Wars, Aristides, his conservative opponent. Pericles was nearly ostracized, but he managed to wheedle his way out of it. You were in exile for 10 years. It was not like criminal exile. Your property was not expropriated, your family was not bothered. But if you came within the bounds of Athenian domain within that 10 years, your life was forfeit. Well, you can imagine what politicians did with this thing. It just simply became a way of one party battling the other, and it only lasted about a century. Near the end of the 5th century, it was apparent that either Nicias or Alcibiades, two of the great demagogues and politicians during the Peloponnesian War, was going to be ostracized. So they got together and they all voted for a man named Hippocleides, who was a nobody. When that so damaged the reputation of ostracism. But we learn a lot about spelling and about literacy. There are about 16,000 of these ostraca that were found after the ostracism took place. They were used as road fill. really important writings of the Athenians and other Greeks were put on stone, and often on large stelae, which were put up in public. Here you see a stele that contains a famous decree. After the Macedonians under Philip and Alexander became powerful, the Athenians worried that they would that someone in the Athenian citizenry would help overthrow the government in favor of the Macedonians. So they passed this anti-tyranny decree. It has this beautiful relief sculpture on the top of allegorical figures of democracy crowning Demos, the personification of the Athenian people. I think we can anyway, the little letters you might see at the bottom here, it's amazing how small they could be, but when they were highlighted with color, you could read the inscription quite easily. A little more about graphic bureaucracy in Athens. This large sanctuary of the mother god was devoted to the keeping of public documents. It was the state archive. Why a religious sanctuary? The church and the state were virtually the same thing in ancient Greece. And to violate a sanctuary was a kind of ultimate sin. So a way of ensuring the preservation of documents, even your own writing, you could dedicate them to a god or a goddess. So here were kept archives on papyrus and also shingles, wooden boards that were whitewashed and then written in black ink. And right across the street from that is a public bulletin board, which was the Athenian equivalent of the telephone and the telegraph, and now the email. This is slightly restored state of this public bulletin board, but you can see it better in this partial artist reconstruction of the thing. It was a fenced-in area with a high platform, and on that platform were 10 statues, one to each of the eponymous or namesake hero of the 10 voting groups. So you could go to the statue of your tribe, and you would find under it, posted on the platform, all kinds of public documents. You were being called up for militia duty, or your taxes were due, or you were a candidate. And of course, people were constantly going between the capital city and the villages in these various offices. So that's mainly how information was transmitted throughout the Athenian city-state. Now we'll talk about the propagation of the alphabet from Greece to the rest of Europe. The Greeks were great seafarers and merchants, and when they came out of the Dark Ages in the end of the early 8th century, the population began to grow. And if you've ever been to Greece, you know it's a rough country. It can only support so many people. Even today, I always say, the greatest export of Greece has always been Greeks. In the first great wave, many of them came, in modern time, came to the United States, then Canada. Now a lot of them go to Australia. The country can only support a population of about 9 million. So they sent out colonies, both for commercial purposes and also diffuse political problems at home. And the Greeks colonized the whole littoral of the Black Sea, much of southern Italy and Sicily, and they had colonies as far away as Marseille. Massilia was an 8th century colony of the Phocians from one of the islands. The rest of the Mediterranean was largely ruled by the Phoenicians, much of North Africa and Spain, and they had their greatest marketplace at Carthage in what is Tunisia today. So, this propagation of the alphabets occurred very early when there were these local, slightly different alphabets among the Greeks. And one of those colonies came to the Bay of Naples, right here, a place called Cumae. That was a colony of the people from the Greek island of Euboea. And they had a particular alphabet that came here in the late 8th century. And that alphabet was disseminated among the various Italic tribes and also the Etruscans. The Etruscans were another powerful and wealthy group of people. Therefore, the Greeks did not colonize the northern part of Italy. We still have the name Tuscany, which comes from the name of the ancient Etruscans. We don't know the Etruscan language, but since they use the Greek alphabet, you can pronounce Etruscan, but you don't know what it means. We can tell that there isn't much worth reading anyway. There are hundreds of funerary monuments. I think the longest text in Etruscan is on a papyrus of about 30 lines. Well, eventually, Rome and Latium, the Latins, overwhelmed the rest of the Italian peninsula. And their alphabet was the one that supplanted all of the other forms of the alphabet. And that is essentially our alphabet. We call our alphabet the Latin or the Roman alphabet because it was propagated mainly from Rome. So this is the West Greek alphabet of the people at Cumae. The Roman or Latin alphabet, which is essentially ours. Some of the differences in our alphabet from Greek simply are the evolution of the signs. If you flip gamma over a little bit and then you round it, it becomes our C and G. Likewise, delta becomes D. Pi becomes our P, and this is can be confusing to beginners in Greek because the Greek sign for rho was predominantly, looks like our P. But the version that came to Italy and was adopted by us had a little tail on it, and that became RR, so that ambiguity went away. We could look at a comparison of our alphabet and the Koine Greek alphabet as it is today. Most of these differences can be accounted for by the alphabet that came to Italy in the 8th century, or adjustments to the Roman alphabet because of changes in language from the time of the Romans on. Just point out a couple peculiarities. For some reason, the Etruscans and the Romans wanted to distinguish a voiced guttural from an unvoiced guttural. Gamma, the third letter of the Greek alphabet, is obviously a voiced guttural, the G sound. So they moved that, they created a new letter with a squiggle on it and moved it to the position of 8 zeta, which they put at the end of the alphabet. Anyway, I don't need to go into all of those details. Especially interesting was upsilon, one Greek letter that became first U, then it became V, which was pronounced in Latin as a W sound. Caesar said at the Battle of, I forget the name of the place in the Near East, Weni, Weedy, Wiki. I came, I saw, I conquered. If he had lived 400 or 500 years later, he would have said Veni, Vidi, Vici, the Italianates pronunciation of Latin. So they had to, once V sound became W in pronunciation, they had to invent another letter. So W was simply a double, or the Spanish call it doble V, double V. And then Y was added as a further consonant and vowel. One other offshoot of the Greek alphabet which occurred much later in European history, was first the Glagolitic alphabet. Some of its signs were simply invented. Some of them are based on Greek, but they're very far removed in form. This was a form of writing that was instituted by the Byzantine missionaries to the Slavic people so that they could translate scripture into the language of these people. But it was supplanted about 200 years later, the 11th century, by the Cyrillic alphabet, named for one of these missionaries, Saint Cyril. And it is derived quite directly from the Greek alphabet, and it's one that you're familiar with from Russian writing. It's the alphabet of most of the Slavic-speaking peoples today, and many peoples who speak non-Indo-European languages in Central and North Asia. So that accounts for virtually all of the writing systems of Europe and much of Central Asia. Now I'll talk about a couple of anomalies in writing that occur in Europe early on. One is called Ogham, and it was used between the 4th and the 9th century to write the Gaelic branch of languages in the Celtic family of languages. This was Irish, first ancient archaic Irish, then Old Irish, and also Manx, the language that was spoken on the island of Man, and Scottish Gaelic. The signs are separated here, but Ogham was written on one vertical continuous line, and then the individual sounds were indicated by horizontal marks that came off to the side, off to the right side, then the left side, then diagonally on both sides, and then the vowels, horizontal lines through that vertical line. And then a few signs were invented to convey double vowel sounds. There are only about 400 inscriptions in Ogham, and most of them are quite short. The etymology or the origin of the motivation of this writing system is a mystery. Some people think that it was invented by the Druids so that they could secretly communicate with one another among those who knew the Latin alphabet. It overlaps for a long time with the Latin alphabet. Most of the inscriptions are found in Ireland, and a few of them are found in West Britain, in Pembrokeshire, West Wales. Another much more common system of writing that prevailed in Europe between the 2nd and the 12th century is runic writing. We have some manuscripts that are written in runic. It was a system that was based in part on the early Latin letters, that is, of the Italic peoples before the Roman alphabet became. You can see that some of them resemble the B letters like ours are. Others have mutated so that they were either invented independently or they were not based on early Italic writing system. This prevailed in Central Europe and in Northern Europe in different phases. As Christianity spread into Europe northward, runic was gradually replaced by the Latin and Roman alphabet. First in the south by the 7th century, but it prevailed most strongly in the north among Germanic and Scandinavian people. And we have the best evidence of it in so-called rune stones. Most of these are memorials to their funerary memorials, but many of them are found not at grave sites. And I'll show you a couple examples. This one is from Sweden. It's beautiful work. The writing is in outlines that form the body of these highly stylized dragons. And then Christianity had reached, by the 11th century, had reached Sweden. And we have a number of other artistic ornaments, and this is one of those funerary dedications. This is another one that was written on two faces, and it's kind of a poignant inscription. The parents of these two boys, Mani and Svenny, who died in London. We don't know whether they were raiding or trading. From what I read about the Vikings, they get a bad name that they really don't deserve. Scandinavian archaeology shows that they were a highly diversified culture and often advanced in many ways. But when they beat up on Anglo-Saxons and other people, they got a very bad reputation, which has been heightened by popular literature. So it's nice to see that even Viking parents worried about the fate of their children. Now we come into the Middle Ages. This is a revolution in the form of the book. Remember when we talked about papyrology, the book was a scroll on two spindles that were, this was the common form of a book throughout the Roman period when there was still trade with Egypt. But once that trade broke down and the supply of papyrus stopped, books became largely made of treated leather, vellum or parchment it's called. And this is a very time-consuming and expensive process. So the ownership of books in the early medieval period, throughout the medieval period, was very expensive. They were the exclusive right of wealthy people. And so this is a great inhibition on literacy. I'll just show you a couple of examples of this. This is from a manuscript of Virgil's Georgics, and it's in a very nice hand, square capitals. This is typical of very early manuscripts, but later on, in the Merovingian Renaissance, this is the time of King Clovis and his descendants. When I took my seminar in medieval paleography, I had to read Merovingian. At first, it's a kind of process of decipherment, but once you get used to the scribe's hand, it's amazing what you can make of it. This is a page from one of the prayers of that period. I should say about these books, the book became, from the scroll, to a book very much like what we have today. These layers of parchment were bound together in folios, which is just a word that means leaf or page. And these books were produced at various renaissances throughout the history of the Byzantine people and the medieval Europeans. Between those renaissances, these traditions were kept alive largely by the monastic traditions. Copies were made in monasteries, and much of the literature of ancient Greece and Rome survives because of this habit of monastic copying. To some degree, it's accidental. It's analogous to human evolution, because individual disasters could cause the loss of some great works of literature. The burning of the library at Alexandria is a famous example. But there was a kind of Darwinism, that is, selection of the best types of literature. The more popular or the better it was during these Renaissance, the more copies were made, and hence the possibility of survival was greater. We know, for example, that Aeschylus and Euripides each wrote over 100 tragedies, but we have only 7 from each of them. We know that Roman libraries and late Greek libraries were full of all the other tragedies of these poets. But we can be pretty sure from what we know of the other plays that the 7 we have are very good ones. And they survived because there was more copies of them. I think it's time to break here. We come back.
And now it's the second half of Jerry LaLonde's course. Jerry.
Thank you. Okay.
High school kids, probably a dozen or half a dozen.
The transition from scroll type books to folio books presented some problems supposedly, and thanks to Doug and Warren Coggins, I can show you this humorous video. I hope. Yes.
Ansgar?
To be the captain of Timberlake.
Ja, hei du. Hei du. Ja. Ja, hva gjelder det? Ja, det er denne her. Ja, vil du si? Takk. Ja. Ja, så den, jeg har ikke fått gjort noen ting hele formiddagen. Nei, jeg beklager. Det tar tid. Kanskje vi holder på å legge om til et helt nytt system, og da skal alle ha helt på en gang. Ja. Så du kommer ikke inn i den, eller? Nei, bare ligger der. Altså, hvis det hadde vært så enkelt, så hadde jeg jo ikke tilkalt helt. Så hadde jeg vel så på en kant. Nei, det skal være fortsatt. Ja. Du bare gjør det. Sånn. Ja, da er vi i gang. Ja, så langt kom jeg også. Ok. Men så stoppet det opp, og så var jeg redd for at noe av teksten skulle forsvinne. Ja, ok. Nei, men du skjønner, inni her, så ligger det kanskje flere 100 sider med lagret tekst. Så for å komme videre, så tar du tak i et ark, på den måten her, og så blar du over på neste side sånn. Da fortsetter teksten der. Jeg blar, altså. Du blar, ja. Men jeg skal tilbake da. Ja, da bare blar du tilbake. Jeg slutter der, og så fortsetter den der, ja. Når jeg skal avslutte dagen, hva gjør jeg da? Da bare slår du sammen permene. Ja. På den måten der. Sånn. Da er nok ut her, ligger alt lagret inni der. Altså, jeg risikerer ikke å miste noe av teksten her nå. Ja, det er fyr på hele grad, det er kanskje litt sannsynlig. Ok, for det er noe med det at når du holder på med skriftruller, så tar det litt tid å konvertere til å bla i en bøk. Ja, men du, en til før det går. Bare gå igjen en gang til. Altså, jeg åpner sånn, og så, hva kaller det? Jeg blar frem og tilbake, og når jeg er ferdig, så bare lukker jeg den. Flott, kjempefint. Ja, men du, vent, ikke sant? Nå er den sånn igjen, nå får jeg ikke åpne den. Det er litt gyrende, altså. Ja vel. Har du ikke tenkt meg? Å ja, den ja. Ja, samme problemet. Får det ikke opp.
I'm sure there's a way I could forward to where I was without doing this, but I'm like Brother Ansgar. Time machine.
Well, that's healthy sketch up. There you go.
Okay. I promised at the beginning I would say something about writing as political issue, and like language, writing becomes highly politicized at times. Not only literacy itself, but often even the type of font that is to be used. The great revolution in writing, probably the greatest revolution after the invention of writing itself and the alphabet, was the introduction of the printing press in the middle of the 5th century, and also the introduction of paper, which was a technology known in China even from the pre-Christian era. But it didn't pass into Europe until the Arabs adopted it. Then it came to Portugal and Sicily in the 10th or 11th century under Arabic influence. But the intersection of these two technologies in writing, the printing press and the introduction of paper, which could be mass-produced by simply laying the pulped fibers of wood or textile onto a porous surface. Now, as opposed to the production of maybe 3 or 4 pages of parchment a day by a scribe, 3,600 pages could be turned out in a single day with the printing press and paper. Of course, this had a great effect on literacy, because now books could become available to a large part of the population, not just those who had wealth. This presented a great problem also. I will talk about the Reformation, that is the Protestant Reformation of the early 16th century, when Luther posted his theses. By this time, writing was, with printing press and paper, was producing, during the lifetime of scholars, popular scholars like Erasmus and Luther, was producing hundreds of thousands of their works during their lifetime. And it was an important part of the Protestant Reformation that people should be able to read, have access to those scriptures, and be able to interpret them themselves. The reaction to this was, of course, by the Church of Rome, whose magisterium considered itself the exclusive authority to interpret Scripture or all kinds of other matters that had to do directly or indirectly with theology, including science. Here you see a painting depicting Galileo before the Congregation of the Holy Office for the Trial of Heresies, a great official euphemism for the Roman Inquisition. Before this, Copernicus, shortly before his death, had published his work on the celestial bodies, the movement of celestial bodies, and the important core of that was, of course, the heliocentric theory. And part of the interpretation of Scripture by the Roman Church was that in the book of Joshua, where it says that the sun stood still so that the Israelites could defeat their enemies before dusk, this was taken as proof of geocentric theory. This was a theory that was still very popular because it was the model by Aristotle and Ptolemy, two great Greek thinkers. But it was not simply a matter of science for the Roman theologians. The geocentric theory also embodied what they considered to be God's design of the universe, with the earth and the humans on earth as the unique center of creation. Well, Galileo was one of the great innovators. The Roman Church believed that reading too widely and deeply was a danger to the immortal soul, and we'll see that it could be a danger also to the mortal body. Because Galileo, with his improvements of telescopes, was able to observe the moons of Jupiter, the phases of the planet Venus, and also the regular appearance of sunspots. Very good evidence for the heliocentric theory. So he was brought before the Inquisition, and he only saved his life by recanting his scientific beliefs and spending the rest of his life in house arrest. Maybe less fortunate or more fortunate is the case of Giordano Bruno. A few years before Galileo, he was a Dominican friar who had some wild theological beliefs. He also had some cosmological and astronomical theories that we would consider very advanced. He considered the possibility that the universe was infinite, that the distant stars were other suns about which may orbit other planets, which may have had intelligent beings. Well, this was very counter. So Giordano Bruno was extradited to Rome and interrogated for a long time. In the end, he was willing to give up his theological heresies, but he was unwilling to give up his astronomy and his cosmology. And so he was burned at the stake in 1600 in the Campo dei Fiori. It was once out of the country, the field of flowers. It's still the flower market in modern Rome. You can see a picture with this dour bronze statue sitting in the place where he died. One person's heretic is another person's martyr for the freedom of thought and expression. So, literacy. It's a great liberating quality or technology, and it's also a way of suppressing and censoring, prohibiting the freedom of people, and it goes on still today. You've read recently probably about Malala Yousafzai, who was this young Pakistani woman who at the age of 15 was shot in the face because of her advocacy of women's education. Fortunately, she survived, and she is the youngest ever Nobel laureate, being recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize. Another political aspect of writing is the degree of tradition and art and heritage that is invested in it by nations and groups of people. It's very doubtful that the Chinese or the Japanese would ever go to an alphabetic system that would completely supplant their system of characters. There's one dramatic example in recent history of the change of a method of writing completely, and this was by Ataturk in the reform of the overthrow of the Sultanate in Turkey. He did away with the Arabic script, and it was replaced with the Roman alphabet. It was an attempt at modernization. I think one thing that made that somewhat easier was that the Turks are ethnically and linguistically not Arab people. One last example, and this shows you how politics can get involved even in the font. You're looking at an example of Frakturschrift, as the Germans called it, broken script, which was used up until the early 20th century throughout the Germanic countries and also Scandinavia. In 1941, the Nazi Reichsleiter Martin Bormann passed a decree that said Frakturschrift was no longer to be used in any German offices because it was Judenletter, Jews' letters. This was obviously a gratuitous swipe of the Jews because the Nazis themselves up to that point and all intellectuals throughout a wide part of Europe had been using Frakturschrift. We can conclude from this that the only good thing about the Reich of 1,000 years was that it was the shortest millennium in human history. Now I'll say a bit about the present and the future of writing. There have been many attempts, and there will still be many attempts to reform writing, but I think the thesis is right that the alphabet is the ultimate system of writing. It is the most efficient by providing a single grapheme for every phoneme, that is a sign for every minimal unit of language. There's not any great progress beyond that, but that hasn't forestalled people. We'll look first at phonetic spelling. Obviously, phonetic spelling could aid in the learning of the English language, especially because we draw our vocabulary from so many different languages. Just look at these words that have the common phonemes, O-U-G-H. And if we went to phonetic spelling, it would be much easier. It could be a way of facilitating the learning of reading in English, but eventually, since these attempts at phonetic writing fail, partly for aesthetic reasons. So you would eventually have to throw away the crutch of phonetic spelling. Also, the vowels present a problem. Look at the vowel A with 4 different phonetic values. We could use diacritic marks to distinguish them in this new phonetic system, but then you're adding more and more to the total of signs that people have to learn. We could spell rendezvous and bouquet this way, but the French would have even a less high opinion. Then you see a quotation from Macbeth that Mark Twain cites, "Lay on Macduff, and damned be he who first cries, oh, enough." And Twain's comment on this was, "To see our letters put together in ways to which we are not accustomed offends the eye, and it also takes the expression out of words. It doesn't thrill you as it used to. The simplifications have taken all the thrill out of it." So much for phonetic spelling. There is a cause for phonetic precision in writing for purposes of science and education. And this was realized in the 1880s with the first international phonetic alphabet. Here you see a version in this table of 1993. I think it was last updated in 2005 when it had 107 letters, 52 diacritic marks, and 4 prosodic marks. Those are marks that indicate things like tone and accent and so this is a very useful system for linguists, for people who teach therapeutic speech therapy, singers, lexicographers. What you see in your dictionary in the pronunciation phase is essentially the International Phonetic Alphabet. It's hard to improve on this, but people have tried. If we go back, look at the bottom, you see the name of Otto Jespersen. He was a famous Danish linguist. And he invented a system for what he thought was a more accurate determination of the sound of language. The Greek letters represent the organ that is used, the lip or the tongue. The Arabic numbers, the degree or form of the opening of that organ. And Latin letters, the articulatory position, that is, whether it's a back vowel, a central vowel, or a front vowel. And here, for the simple sound of U, you have his formula. It's sort of like a chemical formula. I think this is a case where the cure turned out to be worse than the disease. Another form of phonetic writing, just mention in passing, is this used by pilots. It also is meant to convey clarity, often in old radio transmission. A name might be lost, the distinction of the name. So if I were to give my name to the person who was measuring the quality of my bombing run, I would be Lima Alpha Lima Oscar November Delta Echo. We can go to stenography. This is not so common today, but it used to be, some of you remember when secretaries all had to know shorthand. Shorthand is essentially a syllabic system of writing, so that you have fewer sounds. The purpose being that you could write about as fast as somebody could speak. And also the signs were much simpler in the number of strokes. I have here the Lord's Prayer in numerous shorthand systems. Some of you may remember how to read these. Now, cryptography is another form of writing, means secret writing. The simplest forms of cryptography are simply substitution, individual signs for other signs. They can be phonetic or they can be written. Morse code is a good example, where we have a series of variations of dots and dashes, which is a form of writing. But it's a secondary kind of writing. It cannot be read without being translated into a primary form of writing. Of course, modern cryptography is done by machines where the values of the content is constantly changing. So it really can't be deciphered unless you have a machine that is calibrated to the machine that sent it. This was not true of the Japanese and German systems of code in the Second World War. You may have seen that marvelous movie recently about the decipherment of the German code. Now, electronic writing, there's a great deal that could be said about this. I'll be kind of brief. First, captioning. You're familiar with it in foreign movies. It's very useful for us. But it's especially useful for hearing impaired people, closed captioning on television. Phone screen voice reading. You can now get a phone with a screen where the vocal transmission will be converted into written form. I went on the internet and tested some of the sites that sell some of these translation programs. I admit they're not the NSA or the CIA, but I found that text-to-speech translation was quite accurate. Likewise, speech-to-text translation, but interlingual text translation, half of the common verbs got left in English when I tried to translate it into modern Greek, and it made numerous mistakes, such as the word sheet came out of sheep. When I was at the University of Washington, the Department of Slavic and East Asian Languages, this was at the height of the Cold War. It was virtually a satellite of the State Department. And then they were trying to develop by computer a system of translating Russian. And it never really worked. I think the progress in that area has been great, but I wasn't able to test it with these commercial programs. Writing in the computer, this is one of the great advances in our technology. Having been raised on a non-electric typewriter, I really realized the value, and I'm at a very low level of technology, but the use of the computer in my research, both in the form of writing, but also in the use of it as a research source, the databases, are a great thing. Internet, smartphones, and texting. I think I have, as soon as I saw the title of this web page, I knew I wasn't going to like it. Especially when I read that the author claimed that this is the most significant advance in the history of writing since the printing press. For one thing, it's not an invention. None of this is new. If you look at these various electronic signs, they are types of writing that we've already talked about and do not work very well. There are consonantal syllabaries, there are acrophones, that is, initial letters to stand for words. This is all well and good as far as it works, but the intellectual limits of it are great. And when I see young people all day walking around like this, I wonder about the transcendency of their minds. Now I'll talk about cassigraphy, that is universal writing. This is another area in which there have been many proposals, and they fall roughly into three types. International pictography. This would be a system where you use just pictures where the meaning of the picture, the object or idea that it represented would be clear to anyone in any language. Obviously, this is impossible. It's like the Tasmanian poster I showed you, or any other thing. You would have to memorize tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands of visual symbols. Nevertheless, a few years ago, Pam Ferguson, who was president of the college, asked me if I would represent the college at a conference in Beloit on the future of writing. And one of the theses where I was a panel member was that picture writing was going to be the future of writing. The poor man didn't realize that this was not progress, but regress to the most primitive and undemocratic form of writing. And a man in the audience raised his hand and said, "I teach ancient philosophy. How am I going to fit into this?" Well, the speaker had illustrated the future of writing by putting colored illustrations of razors, which were a graph to show how many men shave every other day rather than every day, and a cartoon with no writing. And he said to this man, "Well, you philosophers will be like classicists. You will be useful as data input people." In other words, we're now going to start drawing razors for the future of writing. International logography, this is where we have a word sign for everything, not a picture necessarily, but an ideogram. May not be recognizable as a thing, but it would be intelligible in any language as the word for an object or an idea. And we've seen that the difficulty of this in the Chinese system of writing, where writing has to convey numerous languages and therefore is highly reliant on these ideograms, logograms, word signs. Finally, the international alphabet. this is a system that could really work, but it has the disadvantage that I've mentioned a number of times, that the great tradition and art that is invested in national and ethnic systems of writing are not going to give way to an international alphabet, at least not give way. It might be, as the Chinese now do in teaching English, become a parallel method of writing. So, getting close to the end here, what do I think about the future of writing? First, I'll be pessimistic and then optimistic. I find that a lot of the electronic writing and also some popular writing in the printed media, let me take a parallel example of television. I don't have a fancy cable program, I just have the basic channels. But I will say that in prime time, looking for something enlightening and cultural on television is a little bit like a blind man looking in a dark room for a black cat that doesn't exist. And I feel a little bit of that way about the way electronic writing and some printed writing is being used today. I'll probably be censured for that opinion because I just read that the new host of The Daily Show is getting a lot of flack by saying that in-flight turbulence is caused by the updraft of ignorance from Earth. If you think that is pessimistic, remember the remark of Christopher Hitchens. Earth is a penal colony and an insane asylum for a distant planet of intelligent beings. But to end on a positive note, there is a lot of good to be learned from the history of writing, and I think the future of writing has great potential for the improvement of the human condition. Thank you.
What's your opinion of not teaching cursive writing?
Oh yeah, I meant to mention that, I'm sorry. Several people have brought this up. Before I retired, everybody could write in cursive penmanship, and then suddenly, years later, I taught a tutorial, and I noticed in the exam they were all using square printing. And I thought, gee, this is slow. The exams were very short. So then I have to start letting them take the exam on a computer. Problems arise. I mean, my wife, Dory, is the great archivist of the library here. And libraries are a great exception in our culture. They provide us a way of getting some signal out of all of this noise. But when a student comes to do research and the archival material is in cursive script, it's like me having to learn Merovingian lookhand. And as somebody pointed out, this will create a new elite, those people who can read cursive penmanship.
How do these students write their signature?
Those are the only letters they learned.
Oh, they
We were doing stuff at the course one time and we had to...
They're like my uncle down in Texas. He signs his name with X's.
I got two questions. You know, just like we kicked Pluto out of the group of planets, it's not a planet anymore. How come we don't kick X out of our alphabet? What good is it? And my second question is, I love to alphabetize things, But why is the alphabet alphabetized the way it is? In other words, what's the logic of A
There's
and
no
Z
logic.
at the end?
There's no logic to it. It started with the canon of the order of signs was started by the Proto-Semitics, and there's no determined reason for the order. It started out to be arbitrary, but then it became the custom clear down to our time.
Okay. So how about X?
About X,
What good is X?
all of the Greek alphabets that I mentioned, all those local alphabets are divided between those who use the X sign as we do, that alphabet that came to Italy, for the guttural and the sibilant. In other words, our X sound. The other Greek alphabets used it as an aspirate sign, CH. And if you can see this in the sign for Christ's name, hero. We use CH to convey what the Greeks conveyed by the letter Chi. So it was just an accident that we got that, and there were Greek alphabets that had this letter C for that sound, but there were other Greek alphabets that used this. So we could easily get rid of it. All writing systems are compromises. The big uncompromise is to go to the International Phonetic Alphabet. It's okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jerry.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure, and you're a great audience.
There isn't any way that you and the planning committee can express our thanks to people like Jerry who come and teach these courses. But as you know, Nisha Worley is the resident poet and artist on our planning committee, and she always does the best she can to help us express our thanks. This is a card that she has designed especially for Jerry this week. It has thanks written in many languages on it, which we think is appropriate. And on the inside, you will recall everybody has signed this. So we thank you very much, Jerry. It's been a marvelous course.
I am most welcome.
And no thank you would be complete without a poem from Nisha. So I will try to do it justice. She had to leave early for an appointment today. It's called, What's That You Say? Language is a funny thing. It has so many uses. We use it to express such things as greetings and excuses and happiness and inner thoughts and how we feel today and whether we enjoyed the meal that we just put away. We can't imagine never being able to express what we just saw or heard or felt, so others wouldn't guess that we have no opinion on this world in which we live, that we have minds that hold no more than that held by a sieve. We want our friends to know that we are bright and oh so keen, that wondrous thing beneath our hair we lovingly call our being is working overtime to prove to all those that we know that mind of ours is limitless in where it wants to go. If just perchance we speak too fast, say something that is dumb, don't just sit there and stammer and stare and feel all weak and numb, but pick a foreign phrase that you can quickly interject to dazzle those around you so your boo-boo they'll forget.
I'd like to make one announcement, just briefly before we leave. We're going to have a lecture at the college on Thursday, April 9th in Joe Rosenfield Center at 7:30 by a great Tunisian scholar on Roman mosaics from Tunisia. It'll be very interesting and colorful. And if some of you have bulletin boards around your residence, please take a poster. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. If you have filled out your evaluation forms, you can put them on the table in the hall. And remember, next week is Sarah Purcell and the death of Abraham Lincoln. We will hope to see you all next week. Remember to come early. Thank you for coming.